Hello, Brabs. We're back with chapter 2. I see the saucers. No introduction, let's just get right into it, bruv. Like most people, I hadn't paid much attention to the talk about flying saucers. Oh, that's right, I wasn't supposed to read in this bad accent. Like most people, I hadn't paid much attention to the talk about flying saucers until I read a book by Desmond Leslie and George Adamski titled Flying Saucers Have Landed. Reading this book back in 1953 changed a great deal of my life. Henry Made, an advertising salesman in Detroit, had put the book into my hands. A reading of the book recalled to my mind Kenneth Arnold, who had experienced a sighting near beautiful Mount Rainier in June 1947. I recalled scattered reading involving several newspaper accounts on the subject. I had been interested in these items, but not beyond the average individual. The Adamski-Leslie book advanced the idea that there were friendly human beings on other planets who demonstrated a more godlike way of life for us to follow. To me, it seemed almost too good to be true. I had never seen a saucer, not until then had I been greatly interested in them. As I went about my task of making a home for my two teenage sons, Michael and John, and my professional work. I was divorced and thus head of the household. My family responsibilities and my job as an actress teacher on television. I did a show for preschool children. It was called Play School, and she played Midge. Kept my nose to the grindstone and my eye cast down to the ground, apparently as I went about each day's full schedule. Then, when I was in the home of Helen and Bryant Reeve, who later wrote Flying Saucer Pilgrimage, for a holiday gathering in December 1953, somebody suggested asking George Adamski to come to Detroit to lecture about his experience related in the book. Since the book had impressed me, let me turn on this heater. And since I had handled such work in the past, I offered to handle the publicity for the lecture. Adamski came to Detroit to lecture on March 24, 1954, and spoke to about 4,500 people. As I heard him lecture of his meeting with a man from Venus, I was doubly impressed by knowing that so many people were interested in what he had to say. The young man from Venus, Adamski stated, had come in and departed in a flying saucer after telling him that the people on all planets of our solar system are watching our atomic experimentation and are concerned about it. They must allow this to go on, Adamski told us, because of the universal law of non-interference, even though we might endanger the entire solar system. Although they were part of our solar system, they would not interfere unless we actually did go too far. The day after I began handling the publicity for Adamski's lecture, my telephone began to ring, and it hasn't stopped ringing since. Whether I liked it or not, I found I had automatically become a public information bureau on flying saucers. When my TV show went off the air in the following September, I knew that I must devote my full time to the work with no remuneration, except from those who wished to share the experience of distributing the material. Before too long, my home, my car, my jewelry, life insurance, and other worldly possessions had gone. In order to keep my material going out through the mail and to maintain the other expenses of the work, more people began to write, asking about the saucers. My lecture and meeting duties increased. I wrote to Wright-Patterson Airfield in Dayton, Ohio, where it had been rumored that an official investigation of saucer sightings had been going on for some time. I asked them if I were violating any security matter in passing on to others saucer sightings and other allied information. They telephoned me, collect, and told me that I was not. They explained they also had a very serious program going on concerning UFOs and asked that I let them know. They explained they also had a very serious... Oh, I see. Should I come across something I might consider them to be interested in? In April of 1958, yeah, they were watching you, Laura. In April of 1958, an agency in Washington, D.C. wrote me saying they were aware of my saucer group activities and asking my opinions of such groups. They hoped that someone from that department would soon have the pleasure of speaking with you personally, which, incidentally, never developed. In the meantime, however, my reply would be kept entirely confidential. as it is not our policy to discredit anyone. Consequently, I consider that I have continued my saucer research with the knowledge, if not official approval, of the government. Pardon. Because of this information here given, many human-minded saucer researchers may consider me to be a spy for the government. Well, if I had not contacted them, many probably would say I was against the government, neither of which, of course, is correct. I am. As the time went on, I handled several more lectures for Adamski as well as for Desmond Leslie, Adamski's co-author, when he came to this country in 1965. 55. Leslie is a handsome man, younger than Adamski, second cousin to Winston Churchill, who also believes in saucers, who has never had any particular sightings of his own to hear him tell it, but he continues to write in connection with them. His portion of flying saucers have landed goes back into pre-recorded history to relate unusual incidents, and also includes gleanings from the more recent books of Charles Fort, an American author who, in the late 1800s, did tremendous research into documented evidence of strange sky phenomena, which our scientists and astronomers have ignored. Fort reported that in the late 1700s, the visitors came down in their ships, taking a group of French people on a saucer trip, perhaps to other planets. When they brought them back, their countrymen killed them as witches. What? Let's hope that Earthman will have progressed beyond the point when the next interplanetary guided tour comes up. Together with the group that was helping me, we also brought Major Donald Kehoe to Detroit in 1956. Major Kehoe is the author of many saucer books. While considering the reality of saucers for themselves as interplanetary craft, but denying any possible face-to-face contacts with their occupants, an unusual attitude, to say the least. Having spent a great deal of time with Major Kehoe, promoting this lecture and entertaining him in my home, I know that he has as great an understanding concerning the visitors as you or I might have. But he knows that his mission is to start a skeptical public to thinking, and to take them along gradually into greater understanding. At any rate, while he was organizing NICAP, National, I believe it says National, it goes into the margin, National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, he was not adverse to accepting our mailing list of more than 5,000 persons for promotional purposes. We also brought Captain Edward Ruppelt, who had been in charge of the official Wright-Patterson saucer investigation project known as Project Blue Book, to Detroit for a lecture in 1956. He told us that when saucers first appeared, the Air Force issued a blanket order for crews of armed ships to shoot on sight. But when it had been proved that these strange craft offered no hostility, the order was rescinded, or rewritten to permit each crew to act as it saw fit at the time. Strange orders in both instances. Ruppelt was author of the book Report on Unidentified Objects, which, although it assumed a conservative air, was strangely convincing to most readers that flying saucers did exist. About 2 years ago, Ruppelt, a young man in his 30s, died of a heart attack. Shortly before his death, his book had been suddenly reissued by Doubleday and Company, its publisher, with a completely new section added at the end which minimized and discredited much that the author had said in the main text. This was done at a time when the book was played out. So far as additional sales were concerned, a most uncommercial thing for the publisher to do. I wondered why such a young man with so much still to contribute to the saucer picture should have to pass on. Unless he was a visitor, whose mission was up, of whose job it was to keep the saucer information from coming out too fast as an official, but seeing to it that it wasn't kept from coming out at all. Another man, whom we now miss greatly, was brought to Detroit to lecture. He was Dr. Morris K. Jessup, an astronomer and author of 3 published books on flying saucers. He came back many times to see us. On his last visit, however, we were sorry to recognize an icky feeling which had come into his aura or vibrations, evidence that energies of lesser vibration were pulling down his own, as it can when one is wary or inviting them in by concentrating upon them. He admitted he had been experimenting in psychism as a part of his saucer research, and that he was an admirer of Ouspensky, the Russian mathematician mystic, who did likewise, only to report on them. Later, Dr. Jessup committed suicide. Buck Nelson, a Missouri farmer, was one of our most interesting lectures in 1956. Flying saucers had come down on, oh no, how am I going to read that page? On his farm, and Buck had spent a great deal of time with the visitors. In fact, he claimed they even took him and his dog on a saucer ride to the moon. Pardon. Sorry, we lost our landscape. We went to Landscape Plus. Oh, man. In fact, he claimed they even took him and his dog on a saucer ride to the moon, Mars, and Venus. On the return trip, they brought a dog with I can't do it. They brought a dog with them from Venus. Later, Buck began to try to contact the visitors by radio, against which they have warned us. I have myself received radio messages from the visitors, into which I will go later. Mental contact began to develop in his mind, and his research took a turn towards the mystical and became, in my mind, questionable. The last reports had it that the government had contacted him and was setting aside a certain amount of his money for research into a group that Buck might gather around him. It was said that the race with the Russians for the moon had grown so desperate that even the ideas of crackpots were being considered. Laura calling others crackpots. I'd never seen a saucer myself, but in September of '54, after months of trying to help others understand what they had seen, I had my first sighting. This occurred while I was visiting in Port Huron, Michigan. Port Huron, incidentally, is an area where planes from Mount Clemens Air Base, south of the city, and from Oscoda Air Base, just north of there, do not cross, activity-wise, for about a mile, an ideal spot for saucers to hang out. Though I will add some commentary here, because I believe Laura's first sighting, or at least her version of it, changes over the years, but the Port Huron one is the one she claims was the first one, but then she also claimed she saw one over her own home, so who knows which one was first. While visiting with friends on a sunny Sunday afternoon in late autumn, I was sitting in their large tree-enclosed backyard, more like a field, when I suddenly noticed a huge cigar-shaped cloud on a cloudless day, traveling from our left toward us. As it neared the area in the sky just in front of us, it stopped as though it had put on brakes just about above the treetops, probably less than half a mile away. It was large as a several-storied house and as long as a city block. The remarkable thing about it, however, was that it seemed to be disintegrating, and was, rapidly, before our eyes, as I called the attention of all to it. My younger son, John Michael, was a witness, but the older boy had gone into the house a few seconds before, complaining of feeling nervous, as though picking up the energy of the approaching cloud. He always had a sensitive psyche, the Greek word for the soul mind, often swinging in too far when first welling further into, as a part of the conscious mind, or its positive polarity, ignoring the reasoning of the human mind, which for itself often ignores the reality of the soul or intuitive mind beginnings, reasoning them out of existence, or when catching on, guessing at developments, or imitating. When both are balanced, the Father is able to move and be able to do and say as our highest self, without any preliminary, this must be her affidavit, without any preliminaries, or tip off of the negative polarity of being through our human minds whose natural function is to react to any activity by trying to stop it, or the positive polarity through the soul mind and unsure of itself in its immature beginnings or too sure, looking down on the human side. Let's read what it says. On the afternoon of Sunday, September 7, 1954, the individuals who had signed their names below say the following unidentified flying objects. It was a cloudless blue sky, a slight wind blowing from the north. Suddenly into this cloudless sky came a huge cloud, definitely cigar-shaped in contour, the size of a city block and about 2 or 3 building stories high. It was traveling rapidly into the wind, about 500 feet above the treetops. It came from our left as we were sitting in the backyard in the sunshine and stopped just in front of us, not a half mile away, as though it had been put on brakes. Outside of its rapid travel and sudden stopping, our eyes were drawn to the obvious rapid disintegration of the cloud-like vapor. As we watched within a half minute, 2 saucers suddenly dropped out of the front of the vapor-like cloud, which incidentally still maintained its outline of a cigar shape. The saucers were cylindrical, silver, and a little larger than an automobile. They dropped directly down 100 feet or so, one after the other, as though playing tag, and then shot right back up. And then, I don't know what that says, and up several times as though chasing each other. Their motion was so rapid to allow for distinguishing of detail. After a minute and something and a half's activity, they shot down over the treetops and disappeared. The cloud, however, still keeping its original outline, had been disintegrating still as rapidly all this time, and by the time the saucers disappeared, it had completely disintegrated too. And then suddenly, a spurt of vapor shot back out again, and it too then disintegrated. All this happened within 2 minutes' time and could be seen with the naked eye. Signed by Laura Marks or Julia Moore, it looks like. Anyways, back to the story. There were 8 people present, mostly adults, as we watched 2 disc-shaped objects as large as automobiles drop out of the bottom of the cloud, then shot back up underneath it, dropping back down again as though playing tag with each other. Oh, I guess this is the actual reading. As though playing tag with each other, but not too fast for us to see. They were of a gray metallic color, but with no detail visible. Then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, they chased each other up and over the treetops, off to the right, and disappeared. In the meantime, the cloud had been disintegrating, and by the time the saucers disappeared, it too was gone. A small poof reappearing momentarily, then disappearing as well. But was it a cloud? I discovered later, upon talking to those whom I knew to be visitors, that such clouds are manufactured by the visitors when they want to be active in their saucers, down close to the ground in cloudless days. Later that week, a small disk, the size of a dinner plate, the type I learned that is used by the visitors to monitor conversations, lectures, etc., came down and practically stared me in the face from across the street where I live. These small discs also can pick up an individual's vibrations and reactions to such a sight, or test the fault lines or weaknesses of the planet, either on the surface or under the ocean as well. The information is telecasted back to the spaceship from which it is dispatched, high in the atmosphere, out of sight. During the same week, a radio message had come to me directly on a restricted frequency through the transmitter of some amateur radio operators, or hams, which included Dick Miller, whom some readers know, who had come into our group. Feeling that I might be spoken to, they invited me to be with them. A beautiful, cultured male voice, the most beautiful I had ever heard in all my years of dealing with voice quality in my profession, broke in on the more guttural voices that had begun to talk to us, to tell me that the visitors knew of my help in bringing their coming to the attention of humanity, mentioning the several details of my own personal life of which I had previously considered that only I knew about. Thus, this person identified himself as somebody who knew me better than I knew myself, warning me to beware of those who would fool the public as one from the West approaches who is not as he states, and that time is short. At that time, George H. Williamson, an anthropologist and since author of several saucer books, was scheduled by Henry Madej to talk in Detroit under his personal sponsorship, although I agreed when he asked to help him with the publicity. I was skeptical of Williamson, for he had been using a Ouija board to try to make mental contact with the visitors, and also had been using radio extensively. Since then, I know, of course, that Williamson could be a visitor, and if so, has done a very good job distracting those whom he could in the direction of trying to contact the visitors, such Earth people unaware he was one himself and that they need look no further or towards the past as he went about searching for lost civilizations, intriguing those whose mental electrons are turned themselves towards the first, second, and third dimensions or mental frequencies of being as part of the energies of the atoms of our lower atmosphere on which such experiences of the past and or mental pictures are recorded or embedded, for them to see later for themselves when the true situation is revealed. His first wife dying under mysterious circumstances while they were on an expedition in the jungle. Probably a visitor whose mission was up and who went back home by spaceship. His second wife now divorcing him. No wonder the ancients thought the gods had human attributes or weaknesses, for the Father, through them, had to make it appear that way for us to judge them, rather than straighten them up ourselves. Thus, their Father used their wills and love energies under control for our sakes, a vital difference. Later that fall, as I got out of my car in a parking lot next to a supermarket in Dearborn, where I was going shopping for food to feed my family, in between my increasing number of saucer projects, my eyes were drawn up into the sky where two saucers were being chased by a single motored plane, which had attracted my attention by its roaring motor. Interesting. That's the affidavit of what's coming up. As I looked, the saucers disappeared and reappeared behind the plane, another one joining them as they playfully tagged the plane. Another time, when getting into my car to go on an errand in connection with a saucer lecture I was promoting, I saw a saucer dart from one cloud to another at such a great speed that by all the laws of physics which our science knows, it should have come out the other side of the second cloud, but it didn't. They were able to top on a dime from a tremendous speed, without any ill effect to the occupants. How would you know unless you saw them? Traveling apparently in their own force field, cushioned somewhat like the yolk of an egg is cushioned by the white surrounding it, except the egg is not flying through space at neck-breaking speeds. In Detroit that year, there were excellent sightings other than my own. A mothership was noted dispatching 28 to 30 saucers into our atmosphere by a construction engineer and his neighbors, who reported it to the papers, which in turn referred him to us. The press had by that time become well acquainted with me because of the many press conferences I had been holding for our lecturers. Dearborn had the most interesting sighting of the area, however. Lawrence Cardenas, a Dearborn cook, was driving to work at 5:40 on the morning of September 30th, just as dawn was breaking. There on the Rotunda Drive in Dearborn, he saw the Southfield light ahead turn red, and he slowed down to 20 miles per hour in order to hit the intersection when the light turned green. When he looked into an open field on the right, however, he gasped in astonishment. There, about 10 feet from the side of the road, about 14 or 15 strange-looking little figures dressed in outlandish green uniforms and only 4 feet high gesticulated as they stood about a creature about 6 inches taller. Apparently their leader. The man wore brown uniform-like apparel, and he, like the other small figures, wore a kind of space helmet that seemed to be a glass or plastic breathing apparatus. They also wore goggles and antennae spouted from the helmets, not from their heads. Continued on next page. We may have to read the affidavit because I don't know if she goes into it. Near them was a landed saucer, pulsating, colored energies shining from it. They were near a bridge building project, apparently inspecting the huge machinery as a classroom lecture. The visitors take less evolved people than ourselves on guided tours of this planet as part of their education and as an example of how not to behave. Note, see reproduction of signed statement by Cardenas, opposite page 27. I, Lawrence Cardenas, on the morning of September 30th, 1954, about 5:30 a.m., was on my way to work as steward of the Dearborn Inn. Traveling west on Rotunda Road, Dearborn, Michigan, I had passed the traffic light at Greenfield Road and saw that the light at Southfield Road ahead had just changed to red. I slowed down and paced myself at 30 miles an hour in order not to have to stop at Southfield. I state this to show that I was not traveling too fast. About 1/3 of a mile from the Southfield intersection, my eye was suddenly drawn to a large vacant field to a mass of brilliant color. The color was coming from an object that I would call a flying saucer about 10 feet high, tapering down to the... What does that say? About 10 feet, tapering down to the whatever it is. Portholes were visible. Dawn was just breaking and my car lights picked up almost at the same time near the road a group of about 15 little men between 4 and 5 feet high, standing together, grouped about a taller man in a brown uniform trimmed with gold. The little men were clad in greenish-gray uniforms, had tight-fitting skull caps with pointed beaks on their front and antennae. They had on Jesus Christ. They had on goggles and breathing apparatus, and I could not see their faces, but their hands were moving as ours do when we are gesturing while talking. Some of them turned to watch me as I passed, but there was nothing hostile in their manner. I was past the scene before I realized that what I had seen was a flying saucer, and its occupants. I hesitated going back, only because I was late to work and would have some difficulty explaining why I was further held up. I had no feeling of fear. The men themselves seemed to be on a friendly investigation since the saucer had landed near an area where a road was being built and was near a derrick, crane, and other apparatus. That is Cardenas in a lie detector test given by the Michigan State Police, where they determined that his story was a lie. Cardenas was friends with Laura and Otto. I'm not sure if it was from their time when they both worked at the Dearborn Inn, because originally when Laura and Otto came from Maine, where she grew up in her teenage years and married Otto, they came to the Dearborn Inn after Henry Ford imported staff from New England for his Dearborn Inn, which was styled after New England, the old styled New England Inn. So yeah, she was friends with Cardenas, and I believe by 54 Otto had died. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it was the 60s he died. Yeah, I could be wrong on that. Anyway, that's chapter 2. Next chapter is a winnowing out. I gotta go to an estate sale. Goodbye.